Thanks very much for moving. Where are you visiting from?
Rancho.
Welcome. We have 2 more people from Rancho. You're most welcome. I'd like to start off by letting you know that we received a letter from Mathilde thanking us for our continuous support for the young people orphaned by the genocide in Rwanda. And she reiterates the trials and tribulations that they experience. And what she wants to say is the money raised this year will be used to continue funding a woodshop school and a sewing school we opened several years ago, and for supporting a sisterhood village comprised of 56 housings in the Mayaga region of Rwanda. All funds are used for the sole purpose of helping young people who were orphaned by the genocide in Rwanda. On behalf of our friends at the Friends of Rwanda Association, I thank you again for your support and your generosity and wish you rich rewards in all your future endeavors. So, your generosity is going to go to work, and I assure you that $1 or $5 or whatever goes a lot farther in Rwanda than it does here. So, all right. Today is our annual lecture commemorating the Armenian genocide. When I first learned about Christine Davidian, Christine, would you stand up? Who is the president of the organization Armenians of the North Bay. I contacted her, and the 2 of us put our heads together, and we were able to put together, she was the one, I had an idea, she found the funds, to have an annual lecture every year about the Armenian genocide. It seemed to me that it would be difficult for students to really understand the whole notion of genocide, especially in the 20th century, modern genocides, if we didn't give you some exposure to the circumstances and conditions of the Armenian genocide. So I'm proud once again to say that we can present the Armenian genocide. We're hoping to find a benefactor who wants to have the lecture named after them in perpetuity. So if you know of anybody who is interested, see Christine. I'm also pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Sergio LaPorta is currently teaching at CSU Fresno, which has a very strong Armenian studies program. He's a native of New York and holds degrees from Columbia, a Ph.D. from Harvard, and also studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He speaks several languages. He wouldn't tell me all of them, but he speaks Armenian, he speaks Greek, he speaks French, Latin, and actually gets by in English. So we are very honored and proud to have Dr. LaPorta here with us today. So would you please give him a hand?
Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to thank Ms. Christine Davidian and also Professor Myrna Goodman, the Center for the Study of Holocaust and Genocide, as well as Sonoma State University, for inviting me this evening to speak with you on the occasion of the 95th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. Unfortunately, it's been nearly 100 years since this genocide, the first of the 20th century, as it's often called, has been recognized and acknowledged by the perpetrators. I must admit that I have a bit of an ambitious agenda this evening, because I hope to introduce you tonight not only to the Armenian genocide, its history, its denial, its relevance in modern political discourse, and the dangerous application of genocide recognition as a geopolitical weapon, but I also hope to introduce you to the Armenian people as much as I can. I want to do this for two reasons. First, the genocide does not and should not define the Armenian historical experience. Historical narrative, perhaps inevitably, presents the course of events as directed towards a single point, in this case, as culminating in the genocide, as though the Armenians traveled on an unalterable road. But there were many paths that could have been taken and were taken. The road of Armenian history did not lead only to the death camps of Deir Zor, but to Yerevan, Marseille, New York, Toronto, Fresno, Los Angeles. The story of Armenian history is still being told. And secondly, I have found that when talking about genocide, any genocide, there is a tendency to objectify the victims. Again, to a degree, this is inevitable. It is very difficult to comprehend the amount of human life destroyed in a genocide, and impossible to understand them as individuals. Holocaust and genocide museums have recently tried to use virtual tools to give a sense of the individuality of the people who suffered and were killed by being able to trace the life, not just the death, of specific persons. Personal memoirs and the literature of witness, too, assist us in seeing the individuals among the numbers. For it is hard to remember that they were and are not just victims, but human beings, not just starving corpses, but people who had lives, experienced joy as well as pain. They were not just part of a statistic of 1.5 or 6 million. They each had complex interior worlds. They dreamt. I cannot, or at least have not found a way to fully convey the individual lives of the Armenians who died in the genocide in a lecture. And I fully admit that in how I discuss the genocide below, I am guilty of both constructing a directive narrative and of objectifying the victims. But I hope that by dwelling a bit on Armenian life, I may somewhat lessen these transgressions. Finally, I have also tried to limit my use of graphic pictures in order to avoid a voyeuristic approach to the killings. Although pictures provide important pieces of evidence, and I do use some, and they capture a degree of the horror and rightly stir the emotions, I also find that they can create a distance between us and the subjects, as we stop seeing them as humans, but forever remember them as corpses or as sufferers. By the time of the genocide, Armenian speakers had inhabited eastern Anatolia for over 3,000 years. There had been over 2,500 years of Armenian history, over 1,600 years of Armenian Christianity, over 1,500 years of Armenian literature written in an Armenian alphabet. By the time of the genocide, half a dozen Armenian royal kingdoms had graced the stage of history. Countless churches and monasteries had been built and adorned. Tens of thousands of manuscripts had been copied. The Armenians had never been what we would consider a large people, but nor were they ever insignificant. It is important to remember this accumulation of historical and cultural achievement as the perpetrators of the genocide and of its denial not only wished to exterminate contemporary Armenians and have the crime be forgotten, but also tried to eradicate the historical record and render the Armenians themselves a forgotten people. Thankfully, they have failed in this effort, thanks to the work and resilience of many, both Armenian and non-Armenian, who would not and do not accept the facile comfort of forgetting, but have fought and fight today for the preservation and advancement of our historical and moral consciousness and conscience. Obviously, due to time restraints, I can only give the barest outlines of Armenia's long and rich past before turning more to our topic this evening. But I would like to start off with, if this works, yes, a couple of maps. Where is Armenia? I don't know. In Fresno, most of my audiences are familiar with Armenia and Armenians. There's a very large Armenian population there. But outside of that, I remember when I first started doing Armenian studies, many people would come up to me and ask me, where is Armenia? Next to Romania and Albania. It all had the ya at the end. They're probably next to each other. But it's not, actually. Armenia, as you can see, the modern Republic of Armenia is located there to the south of Georgia, to the east of Turkey, to the west of Azerbaijan, and to the north of Iran. And there you can get an overall view of the entire region. And here is a more close-up of the modern Republic of Armenia and the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. I will talk a little bit about the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh at the end of this talk. As I say, it's who it's bordered by, and it's approximately 11,500 square miles. And that is approximately 1/10 the size of historical Armenia. This is somewhat what historical Armenia was. Now, what do I mean by historical Armenia? Historical Armenia is sort of a difficult concept to describe because it's not just a political notion. That is, this is not areas that necessarily Armenian rulers ruled over, but this corresponds more to the area in which Armenians lived and were the dominant culture and where Armenian became the dominant language for most of the past 3,000 years and up to the genocide. Some of these borders will have moved in terms of where the populations have moved. Mostly they moved further west, and that by the time we get to the 20th century or the 19th century, there are not so many Armenians at the furthest eastern part of this, but there are more on the western side. So, but just to give you a rough idea about the degree to which Armenia went from this on the right to that on the left, all right, in terms of where Armenians lived and were a dominant culture. There are also a few aspects of Armenian history that are essential for comprehending Armenian self-identity at the time of the genocide and today, and as well as for recognizing the full tragedy of the genocide. First of all, Armenians have been around for a long time. Speakers of the Armenian language appear to have migrated to the area around Lake Van, and that you can see is the big lake on the right, approximately around 1200 BCE, or over 3,000 years ago. Our first written mention of the Armenians can already be found in the inscription of Darius the Great from 519 BCE. He was the Shah of Achaemenid Iran, one of the largest empires at the time that had incorporated Armenia. And he mentions both Armenia as a province and mentions an Armenian as one of his generals. And from that moment on till the present day, the relationship between Armenia and Iran have been very, very close. And there's still a large Armenian diaspora community in Iran. And the Republic of Iran and the Republic of Armenia have fairly good and close relations. The largest extent of Armenian political power overall was during the reign of King Tigran the Great, known almost to every single Armenian, who ruled from 95 to 55 BC. At the time, it was the most powerful kingdom in the east, a rival to the Roman Empire, who fought against it relentlessly and eventually brought it to an end. But here you can see how it covered not only historic Armenia, but much of present-day Syria and Lebanon, and even turned the northern kingdom of Israel into a tributary. So we see here Armenians acting on the world history in a major way in the 1st century BCE. The next major, I would say, aspect of Armenian identity that's important to recognize is its Christianity. Christianity penetrated into Armenia fairly early, possibly by the 2nd century, but already by the 3rd century, the middle of the 3rd century, around 250 BCE. BCE, that's good. 250 CE, we have a bishop of the Armenians, which attests to a large Christian community in Armenia. Armenia became the first state to recognize Christianity as its official religion at the beginning of the 4th century through the missionary efforts of St. Gregory the Illuminator and King Tirdot, who made it the official religion. So it has gone down not only in its own history, but also in Western history as being the first nation to accept Christianity as its first religion, as its official religion, and that has made it an important figure in the history of Christianity. However, it is an independent church. It's split with the Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches. It has its own religious head who is located here at Holy Etchmiadzin, which is now in the Republic of Armenia, and importantly was never within the Ottoman Empire. It was either independent or under Persian rule and then Russian rule. And now it's in the Republic of Armenia. And the Armenians are considered, for people who study Christianity, Oriental Orthodox. So they have their own church. They have their own history of Christianity. They're very proud of that fact. And it goes to being a large part of their identity. And it also goes a large part to why the people who were killed in the genocide are not only considered victims, they're considered martyrs, martyrs for their Christianity. And it harkens back, well, let me first talk about the alphabet. Also, soon after being Christianized, about a century later, the Armenians invented their own alphabet, created their own literature, also translated many works, translated the Bible, obviously. And this became a vehicle of Armenian culture, still in use to this day. If you can read the Armenian alphabet, you're opened up now to 1,600 years of Armenian literature. So they're also very proud of that fact. It was originally started by a monk. It was made for the translation of the Bible, so it was intimately linked to their Christianity. The final aspect of their historical existence that I would like to talk about is that of the Battle of Vartanants, or the war against the Persians. And though for us we may think of the year 450, 451 as a long time ago, it's not in the minds of Armenians. Vartan, who led a rebellion against the Zoroastrian Persians who tried to reconvert the Armenians to their pre-Christian faith, was killed in a battle at Avaraya, in the plain of Avaraya in 451, along with most of the Armenian army. He immediately became Saint Vartan, a martyr and defender of the faith. The cathedral, people may know, in New York for the Western Diocese is named after him. He is a recognized saint of the church, and every year the defeat, which turned eventually into a victory, of the Armenians at the Battle of Avaraya is commemorated. There is a commemoration of the battle against the Persians at Avaraya every year in the Armenian church. And this is one of the earliest examples we have of Christian holy war, the concept of Christian holy war. But it's not only as a historical event, because the idea of Vartan and the martyrs gets intimately linked with the martyrs of 1915, of the sufferers of the Armenian genocide, who were seen to carry on this tradition of Armenian martyrdom in defense of Christianity. So we should be aware of these three things. One, their long history in the area. Two, their Christianity. And three, the combination of their Christianity, literature, and their presence to form an Armenian identity, which Armenians still identify with to this day. Okay. Sorry, here we go. Here's a painting we can see from 1953, which is a detail. With the lights on, it's a little hard to identify. But yes, I should say that it was the Book of Maccabees. If people are familiar with their Bibles, particularly not the ones that are used in the modern Protestant churches, but if you're in the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox churches, they have books of Maccabees, and the festival of Hanukkah, or the holiday of Hanukkah, that was used in the histories recounting the Battle of Vartan as the model, so that Armenians saw themselves as continuing not only the tradition of Christ's crucifixion and death, but also that of the Jewish example of the Maccabees fighting against the Seleucids and dying again for their faith. Now, let's jump ahead and start by imagining what it might have been like to be an Armenian in the Ottoman Empire around the year 1860. And in an urban center, let's say Constantinople, the capital, or Smyrna, one of the major centers of the Ottoman Empire. This was a time of great hope and excitement, particularly for Armenians in the big cities of Western Anatolia. Internal and external pressures had moved the Ottoman Sultanate to implement a series of reforms that were intended to increase the security and prosperity of its subjects, and in particular extended rights to the non-Muslim elements of the empire. There were measures to increase education, trade, and protect the life and property of all subjects regardless of faith. The Armenian population of the urban centers of Western Anatolia had steadily increased from the late 16th through the 19th centuries as they fled from war, poverty, and a general lack of rule of law in the East. An Armenian wealthy class and middle class had emerged. Armenians held important posts in the government, such as superintendent of the imperial mint. They founded factories, printing presses, and schools. They ran this famous hotel in Constantinople, the Tokatlian Hotel, which was made famous by Agatha Christie. It's where Hercule Poirot stays in Chapter 2 of Murder on the Orient Express. Anybody can look that up. By the second half of the 19th century, Constantinople had become the largest Armenian city in the world. That is the city that had the most, it's the LA of its day, the city that had the most Armenians in it. And there was a lively intellectual and artistic scene. The sons of wealthy Armenians were being sent to Europe for higher education. Colleges were opening up in Constantinople and in the major urban centers of the provinces. Thanks to the efforts of American Protestant missionaries, Armenian women were also being educated. It's really hard to capture the amount of progress that was done prospects for all classes of citizens. A famous example would be, and I was talking to Christine about that last night, the Tourian family. The Tourian family in Constantinople, the father was a blacksmith. One son went on to become the most famous romantic Armenian poet of the day. He died at the age of 21 in the 1870s of tuberculosis. Two other of his sons, one became the Archbishop in New York, of the Armenian Church in New York after the genocide, and the other one became the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Armenian Patriarch of Jerusalem. So you can see how somebody from what was then considered a humble background was able to have his sons rise up to some of the most powerful positions in the Armenian Church and achieve a level of education that would have been unheard of in a few decades before. At this point, too, modern Armenian as a language bursts out of the chains of its classical ancestor. Up until this point, all Armenian literature had been written in classical Armenian. This would be the equivalent of writing in Latin to this day. It created a sort of disconnect between the everyday person and the cultural elite, who are usually aligned with the church somehow. But at this point, we see modern Armenian, ashkharapar, as they say in Armenian, the vernacular language exploding on the scene. Newspapers, literary journals, books, all poured out across the Armenian-speaking world in this fresh new idiom that nevertheless resounded with 1,500 years of literary depth and 3,000 years of linguistic development. So if you're sitting in Constantinople in 1860 as an Armenian, it looks like you're on the cusp of really a bright and beautiful future. That within no time, equality will be extended all over the empire. It will move from being an autocratic regime to a constitutional monarchy, something a la Britain, and hopefully without the violence that marked the French Revolution. As I said, cultural and educational opportunities were extended to members of the society that never had it before. And people were excited. They were finding a new voice that they never had before. They could write in their own language that they were speaking at home. They could hear themselves in their newspapers. They could hear themselves in their books. They got Western European literature, particularly French literature, translated. So Victor Hugo was translated into modern Armenian. A whole new world was opened up to them. Not only to mention that Armenians were some of the first to develop photography, so they could see themselves in a whole new light as well. This was this was like being at the invention of the internet, for people of that day. So the question is, for many people, and people still puzzle about this today, how do we get from here, a nice, wealthy, upper middle class family in Constantinople, in the 1870s to here, just a few decades later. First of all, not everything was great in the provinces. What I've been describing is basically what life was like in the cities. And we have to admit that not everything was that terrific in the provinces. And we can see the development of two Armenians, and almost of two Armenias. One is that which I just described, comfortably ensconced in the major urban centers of the empire, economically doing well, possibly still feeling a little bit of discrimination, but nothing overbearing for an autocratic regime. The other Armenian lives in the provinces, where the reforms that have assisted his or her cousin in Constantinople have not been implemented or enforced. In the Armenian provinces, the Armenians live without any security, in a state of near constant fear of rapacious tax collectors and plundering raids of Kurdish tribesmen. As Christians, they are not legally allowed to carry firearms. The majority of them are poor agriculturalists. Of the 6 provinces that you can see there, Van, Bitlis, Diyarbakir, Kharpert, Sepastia, and I said which one did I miss? And Erzurum, sorry, and Erzurum. Only Van has a majority of Armenians. The other provinces, most of them have pluralities. That is, Armenians still constitute more than any other minority, but they don't constitute over 50% of the population. So, and in some places, they are even a minority. All right, so this demographic shift is also important to understand. And it's also important to understand why the Armenians did not usually advocate independence, because they realized there would be a political problem if they were independent in areas where they were not necessarily the majority. I do not have time this evening to go into all the historical events that map the course of history from 1875 to 1915, from the Armenians being the loyal millet. And millet was the way the Ottoman Empire eventually organized its non-Muslim subjects. And there were 3 major ones, the Greek, the Jewish, and the Armenians. To the fanatic obsession of the Young Turk regime to exterminate them. But I would like to point to 3 events that are crucial steps along the way. The first is the Hamidian massacres that took place between 1895 and 1896. The empire had suffered a number of military defeats during the 18th century, particularly at the hands of an emerging Russian empire. This culminated in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878. The Ottomans were badly defeated, and significant portions of Armenia were captured by the Russians. Although the European powers interfered and watered down Russia's victory, returning many territories to the Ottomans, the loss had awoken in the Sultan a mistrust of the Armenian population in the east, whom he had suspected of helping the Russian advance. The situation in the Armenian provinces continued to deteriorate as local chieftains and administrators were given a free hand. Again, reforms encouraged by the European powers were not implemented. Armenians began to defend themselves, forming both armed resistance groups and political parties. Demonstrations against injustice and asking for the restoration of law and order in the provinces were held in various places in the early 1890s. The result was the brutal Hamidian massacres that lasted from October 1895 until the summer of 1896. Approximately 100,000 Armenians were killed during these pogroms. We don't have an exact figure. Some people say it's up to 200,000. The more conservative elements, around 100,000. The second major event is the rise of Turkish nationalism. The despotic rule of Abdul Hamid II, the Sultan from 1876 to 1909, did not only alienate Armenians, but also many other members of the empire, including Turks, Jews, Greeks, and Arabs. The most active of the Turkish groups was the Young Turks, a confederation of Turkish liberals who were united in their opposition to the Sultan. Among these liberals, however, there was a strong nationalist tendency. In 1899, even the Sultan's nephew, Prince Sabahaddin, joined the anti-Hamidian groups and helped organize the first Congress of Ottoman liberals in 1902, in which many dissatisfied parts of the empire, including the Armenians, took part. Although these parties were united in their desire to rid themselves of this despotic regime of the Sultan, there were clear divisions in what a post-Hamidian state would look like. The Armenians, along with Prince Sabahaddin, favored a more decentralized, almost federalist organization of the state, with protection for Christian minorities backed by Europe. Many of the Turkish participants thought that such decentralization would lead to the death of the empire and considered it to be a treasonous idea. In 1907, this more nationalist faction of the Young Turks united with members of the military, primarily stationed in Thessaloniki, ancient Salonika, and formed the Committee for Union and Progress, or CUP. In 1908, the Young Turks succeeded in overthrowing the Sultan and establishing a constitutional government in which Armenians participated. However, within this government, it would be the most national elements of the CUP that would eventually come to power in 1913, after staging a coup against the more moderate factions of the Young Turks. The leaders of that coup were also the architects of the Armenian genocide, namely Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha. The ideals of the CUP were based on a nationalist ideology most prominently advocated in the works of Ziya Gökalp. Part of this ideology also aimed at the uniting of Turks of Anatolia with those of Central Asia. The Christian Armenian element that resolutely remained entrenched between them was seen as an obstacle to the successful accomplishment of that dream. And I may add here, too, that it was not only the Armenians that suffered at the hands of this nationalist ideology. It extended also to other non-Turkish elements of the society, so that Arabs were also discriminated against in many areas, not only to mention Assyrian Christians and Greeks. The third event was the massacres at Adana. In April of 1909, between 20 and 30,000 Armenians were killed in the province of Adana. That figure comes from a New York Times article of April 25th of that year. According to the Young Turk government, the cause of this massacre was reactionary forces who were trying to sow discontent. In fact, the Sultan had been placed on the throne for 10 days in 1909, and the Young Turk government said it was supporters of the return of the Sultan who had stirred up anti-Armenian elements in order to try and cause a rift between the Armenians and the Turks. And 124 Muslims and 7 Armenians were found guilty of inciting the riots, and they were subsequently hanged. However, the role of local CUP members in the print media who helped create an environment of mistrust and hatred was downplayed. As much as reactionary forces, the new force of Turkish nationalism, in combination with a certain amount of anti-Christian sentiment, first rears its head in a violent fashion here at Adana, and stands as a tragic and bleak precursor of the terrible events to come. So although this is technically considered normally outside of the guidelines of the Armenian genocide proper itself, in many respects the key forces or the key elements that would trigger the Armenian genocide and be absolutely essential in its implementation are found here at Adana. And this was downplayed not only by the Young Turkish regime, but also by members of the Armenian members of parliament who did not want to blow this incident up into a major crisis. And so everybody pretty much agreed that this was mainly due to anti-reform elements who wanted to see the return of the government, of the Sultan. But it's absolutely clear, if we look at newspaper editorials of Adana in Turkish, that the prior 2 weeks had been filled by members of the CUP writing articles and editorials talking about how the Armenians were going to kill Turks in Adana once, if the Sultan came back to power. So it was absolutely clear that the environment of fear and hatred that released itself at Adana in 1909 had been stoked by the actual members of the CUP. Now, I don't say that those individuals were stirred on by anything in Constantinople. They seem to have been acting independently. We don't know. But we can't separate the fact that members of the CUP who held to a nationalist ideology were using this language. On August 2nd, 1914, Enver Pasha had entered into a secret alliance with Germany to enter on the side of the Central Powers. This it did in October of 1914, attacking Russia. In December, Enver Pasha personally led the campaign into Armenia and the Caucasus. By January 1915, he was badly defeated at the Battle of Sarıkamış and returned back to Constantinople. Tens of thousands of Ottoman troops lost their lives in that failed campaign. Upon his return, he blamed the Armenians for his defeat. In February 1915, Armenians who had been able to serve in the Ottoman army since the Young Turk Revolution were disarmed and were subsequently used for labor. Unfortunately, during the course of the opening months of the war, many pack animals had also died. And so they now started to use Armenians to carry baggages, to carry supplies, to maintain the supply lines. In April of that year, what is now called the Armenian Genocide began. On April 8th, the Armenians of Zeytun and other villages in Cilicia were deported. On April 19th, the environs of Van were attacked, and 55,000 Armenians were killed. The Armenians in the city of Van barricaded themselves and successfully held off the Ottoman army until relieved by Russian forces in mid-May. And the chronology here is somewhat important because shortly afterwards, and to this day, many Turkish denialists claim that it was precisely this activity of the citizens of Van who managed to successfully defend themselves is what sparked the genocide. The genocide was sparked by this uprising of Armenians in Van, and that Armenians were killed because they were trying to put down that rebellion, and then it turned into a sort of civil war. And the problem with that is that the deportations in some areas had actually preceded the uprising in Van. On April 24th, 1915, nearly 250 Armenian intellectuals, artists, and political figures in Constantinople were arrested and deported. Nearly every single one of them was executed. Between April and August, the Armenian population of nearly every single city and town in the provinces was deported. The genocide was premeditated, organized, and ordered by the CUP. The method of elimination followed a set pattern. Young, healthy men were gathered, arrested, and marched out of town. At a short distance from town, they were either shot or bayoneted if they wanted to save ammunition. The elderly, women, and children were told that they would have to leave their towns for their own protection. They then were put on death marches through the desert towards Aleppo, then along the Euphrates to places like Deir Zor. By 1916, over 1 million Armenians had been killed and 500,000 displaced. By the end of World War I, that figure was closer to 1.5 million, that first figure of numbers killed. For the record, these events have been termed genocide by the following organizations: the International Association of Genocide Scholars, pretty authoritative voice on the subject, the International Center for Transitional Justice, the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, the World Council of Churches, over 20 nations, and 44 of the 50 United States states, among other institutions, organizations, and scholars. Despite such significant recognition, the level of knowledge in the United States about the Armenian genocide, in my opinion, is rather low, although it is increasing, thanks to forums such as this. The degree of ignorance regarding the Armenian genocide today is especially surprising in consideration of the worldwide recognition it received and the relief efforts launched in particular by the United States of America. The U.S. was informed of the extinction of the Armenians by nearly 200 articles in the New York Times between 1915 and 1922, by reports of the American ambassador to Turkey, Henry Morgenthau, who's pictured up there, and by accounts of U.S. missionaries who saved many Armenian orphans. In the wake of the genocide, between 1916 and 1930, the United States raised $116 million in relief money. That is the largest amount of humanitarian aid that has ever been raised ever for any cause to this day. In modern terms, it would be $1.5 billion. That's more than we've done for any other issue since then. But the Armenian genocide, in many respects, was really the beginning of the notion of an international relief fund. It was the beginning, for example, of celebrities taking part in this. Charlie Chaplin had a role in it. Jackie Coogan was a child actor and later became Uncle Fester in the Addams Family. He was on posters trying to drum up support for for Armenian genocide relief. So this was, even that I was mentioning also earlier, that the bat that Babe Ruth used to hit the 50th home run in his season was auctioned off for Armenian relief. So the degree and the level, the intensity of it was once said that after England, the only country that Americans knew was Armenia. And that was the one they were most familiar with after England. So that level of recognition, that level of understanding, that lasted pretty much up until the mid-30s. And then all of a sudden hits a sharp decline. And to us today, it seems rather unbelievable. But it's something that the United States should be proud of, and the lack of recognition the United States pays to the Armenian genocide also denies it of its own glorious history in this particular event. And Peter Balakian, in his Burning Tigris, and I think maybe you had to read some of that for this class, has put together a compelling narrative of the U.S. involvement in helping Armenians during and after the genocide, as well as some of the politics of why that changed. In 1933, the Austrian Jewish writer Franz Werfel published his work of historical fiction, The 40 Days of Musa Dagh. This was translated into English in 1934, as well as into 34 other languages. Although it was an international bestseller and received critical acclaim in the United States, already at this point, we can see the tide turning towards suppression of the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians. The Turkish government pressured the U.S. State Department to squash MGM's plans to turn the book into a major motion picture. Sale of the book was severely curtailed in Nazi Germany and often burned. Werfel himself was expelled from the Prussian Academy and fled Austria in 1938. At the same time, a Polish-Jewish jurist, Raphael Lemkin, was studying the events of 1915 and presented in Madrid in 1933 an essay on crimes of barbarity. The Polish foreign minister subsequently forced him to resign his position as a public prosecutor. The amount to which memory of the Armenian genocide had been erased from people's minds is best summarized by Hitler's callous question in 1939 upon the invasion of Poland about, quote, who, after all, today speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians. Lemkin, however, despite being wounded in the hip and losing nearly 50 relatives in the Holocaust, escaped to the United States. He, in 1944, published his magnum opus, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, where he coined the term genocide and specifically invoked the case of the Armenians. So many people argued, well, in those articles of 1915, 1916 that appeared in the New York Times and political dispatches, they never call it genocide. Well, they couldn't have. The word didn't exist. Didn't exist until 1944. But the very case example that was used to describe, to define the definition, was that of the Armenian genocide, in addition to the Holocaust. So from the very outset of the use of the term, those two case studies were given as prime examples. Nevertheless, World War II, the Cold War, and the Republic of Armenia's incorporation within the Soviet Union, and Turkey's within NATO, did little to further the cause of the Armenian people. Armenians themselves had not been in a position to change matters. The generation of survivors in the US and Europe were often silent, even with their own children, while those living under Stalin were not allowed to express any sort of nationalist sentiments, let alone recognition of the genocide. It was only in 1965, upon the 50th anniversary of the genocide, that Armenians were finally ready to speak up and speak out. That year was marked by demonstrations, the biggest one in the Armenian capital, Yerevan. And that year, the first Armenian genocide memorial was erected in Montebello, California. It was also in 1965 that the first country, Uruguay, recognized the massacres as genocide. Since then, the efforts to reawaken public consciousness of the genocide have been growing. And I would direct people to Michael Babelian's new book, Children of Armenia, about how Armenians have tried to fight to rectify that injustice. Before I turn to the question of the current geopolitics of Armenian genocide recognition, I would like to address a question that I often get asked by people who have no specific bias and are generally good people. It happened so long ago in the Ottoman Empire, why don't the Armenians just move on? Even leaving aside the psychological dimension, both on the individual and social level, of the trauma of having an act of violation and violence continued unrecognized, I don't believe this is an either-or problem. Armenians have moved on. They have made significant contributions to every single country they have found themselves removed to. They have an independent republic to which they are dedicating huge amounts of time and money. None of this precludes, however, the larger quest for recognition and justice. In fact, I think the question should be, why are so many bright, open, educated people and governments so obstinately opposed to recognizing this tragedy? Recognition of the Armenian genocide is not just a historical question, but a legal and moral question that haunts us to this day. It is only through recognition that we can successfully attempt prevention. Every genocide is a unique manifestation of humanity's inhumanity, but each one nonetheless encapsulates those that precede it as well as those to come. In addition, it is of the absolute importance that we recognize that although the genocide occurred in the Ottoman Empire, it was not the decision, as is almost always implied, of the Ottoman Sultan. That is, we do not have here, as it is often presented, the flailing efforts of a possibly sick individual attempting to hold together his empire. Not that this would make the results any more savory, but it camouflages the ideological nature of the killing. By insisting on locating the genocide within the context of the Ottoman Empire, usually without any mention of the Committee for Union and Progress, there is a deliberate distancing of those actions from the modern Republic of Turkey. This is not possible. The entity in which the genocide occurred may have still been called the Ottoman Empire, for lack of a better word. But the government did not in any way resemble the Sultanate. Nor did the entire population of Anatolia change between 1916 and 1923. The foundation of the modern Republic of Turkey rests on the Armenian genocide, and on a Turkey without Armenians, as much as that of Germany rests on the Holocaust, and that of the United States rests on the massacre of Native Americans in slavery. And while the present generation of leaders and Turkish citizens may not have done any of the actual killing, they are responsible for the continuation or the cessation of its denial. Let's now turn to the geopolitics of genocide recognition. I have selected, and people may remember from the expanded title, the United States and Israel as case examples, because in all honesty, being American, and for having lived for nearly a decade of my life in Israel, they are the examples I am most familiar with. And also countries whose policy matter and have affected me the most. Possibly if I had lived in France for longer, I'd be more interested in that instance. But having worked at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem for 8 years, have lived in Jerusalem for nearly a decade, and having taught Armenian studies there, I was particularly sensitive to the issue within Israel. But these are not the only reasons. The policy of the two countries and the dichotomy between the official position of the governments and those of the population mirror each other. In both cases, we have governments that don't officially recognize the genocide, but we have populations in which people do recognize the genocide. And U.S. and Israeli attitudes towards the genocide are directly linked, whether correctly or incorrectly in the minds of at least the Turkish government and many in the media. United States policy on the genocide and Israeli policy on the genocide are directly linked. I have already touched upon the reasons for lack of recognition on the part of the U.S. In the post-World War II era, when genocide as an articulated concept was formulated, Turkey became an ally of the U.S. in the Cold War and was officially admitted into NATO in 1952. In formulating this alliance, the U.S. was repeating the policy of the British Empire in the 19th century, namely supporting Turkey in order to restrain Russia. And as noted, Armenia's incorporation within the Soviet Union did little to encourage recognition of the genocide. In addition, there was great effort on the part of the Turkish government and of some, quote, scholars of Turkish history to alter the historical record, to adamantly deny that the genocide had happened. A good example is the respected historian of the Middle East, Professor Bernard Lewis, who in his early 1961 book, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, clearly discusses the annihilation of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire and refers to it as a terrible Holocaust. This narrative is noticeably absent from his later scholarly work. In 1985, several prominent scholars signed a petition published in the New York Times questioning the genocide. Several of those scholars have privately admitted that their motive for signing was fear that they would be denied access to archives in Turkey if they did not. Donald Quartert, an excellent scholar of Ottoman economic history, a professor of history at SUNY Binghamton, and chairman of the Institute of Turkish Studies from 2001 to 2006, was one of those signatories. In 2006, he mentioned in a book review that what happened to the Armenians constituted genocide. He was subsequently forced by the Turkish foreign minister from his position. The Institute for Turkish Studies, funded by the Turkish government in 1982, is a significant source of grant money for scholars of Turkish history. If in 1990, when Bob Dole tried to pass a genocide recognition bill, there was still doubt as to whether the killings had happened, that cannot be said today. And here we can see real progress. Very few people in the United States actually deny that the killing happened. And even those people who do not support a genocide recognition bill in Congress do not say so because they think that the genocide didn't happen. They just normally give arguments that the time isn't right, Turkey is an ally, we don't want to create further instability in the region. Very rarely, if ever, do you hear now that the killings did not happen. Although the Armenian genocide may not be known or taught as commonly as it should be, for the most part, education on this issue has improved. And we are facing a situation in which most members of the government, including the president, as well as of the population, know that a genocide was committed. But those in power are afraid to call it that for political reasons. Now, the issue of the genocide is deeply entwined with three political factors. People may be familiar with this map. I don't know. It's known as the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. This is a pipeline that goes from the Caspian Sea and has an outlet into the Mediterranean and the Republic of Turkey. And it's very easy to see here that it touches upon a number of countries, but conveniently skips Armenia. Now, there were several reasons for why this was. And at the time, the most prominent was, and it's related to this, but I'll first mention a couple of things in connection with this. First of all, we should recognize that there is an alliance of the United States with Turkey through NATO, and then through Turkey with the Republic of Georgia and Azerbaijan, the Republic of Azerbaijan. Counter to that alliance, there is a Russian-Armenian-Iranian alliance. Okay, so the interests of the Russians, Armenians, and Iranians are normally used to counteract those of Turkey, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. And we can never forget that when we're dealing with any issue having to do with Armenia. And it's an uncomfortable position for Armenia, but that is the fact of the matter. Now, one of the reasons why the pipeline, even though everyone says it would be cheaper and it's more direct to go right through Armenia, one of the reasons why it doesn't go through Armenia is because of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I mentioned before that we have a smaller republic right next to it, and you can see it there to the right, to the east of the Republic of Armenia. It is the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. That republic is independent of the state of Armenia. It does not fall under Armenian jurisdiction. It's its own autonomous entity. It had been an autonomous region during the Soviet period of the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, but upon the breaking up of the Soviet Union, it declared independence. There had already been a conflict that had started between the Armenian ethnic population of Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan. There were riots. People were killed on both sides. Large amounts of Armenians were killed in Baku as well. And what started as ethnic violence in 1988 escalated into a full-out war by 1992. Although the Armenians were greatly outnumbered, they eventually won that war by 1994. There was a ceasefire declared. The Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, including, if one includes Karabakh within that, controls 20% of what was the former Republic of Azerbaijan. That conflict, as I said, has still not been resolved. Now, for Armenians, this had a double sort of meaning. One was the actual conflict that was going on. It was a severe, difficult time for Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. But one could not help but hear echoes of the genocide in this conflict. Again, we have a small Armenian population facing a much larger, here Azerbaijani, but the Azeris are Turks, so nonetheless they're a very easy stand-in for the CUP and for the Turks who committed the genocide. But this time the Armenians were able to fight back. And the theme of never again resounded very loudly in Nagorno-Karabakh, and I know many Armenians, both in the diaspora and even in the Republic of Armenia, who were willing to give up the state of Armenia for Nagorno-Karabakh, because this is where they finally could see some sort of redemption from the loss during the genocide. So we can't separate those two issues, the genocide from the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Nevertheless, this conflict, which is seen as a creator of instability in the region, is one of the reasons given for why the pipeline does not go through Armenia, which is the quickest way possible, because it's in this unstable, unresolved conflict, and instead goes through Georgia. Nonetheless, Georgia itself is not considered the most stable of all countries. This is a sort of problematic distinction, since they have two breakaway enclaves within the Republic of Georgia, and Russia went to war with it in the recent past and bombed it. So nonetheless, the United States and Russia would like to see stability brought to the region so that a pipeline could go through Armenia. Right? A lot of argument. The diaspora, that is the Armenians living outside the Republic of Armenia, and many Armenians within the Republic of Armenia severely disagreed with them for a variety of reasons. The most contentious, I would say, is the fact that it establishes a firm border between Turkey and the Republic of Armenia, which means that it's a de facto surrendering of any possible lands that may be returned as part of genocide recognition. The other part that people find objectionable, and I'll talk about this in a little bit as well, is that it calls for the creation of a historical commission to study the events of Armenia's and Turkey's past. Now, it doesn't specifically say the genocide, but everybody feels pretty sure that the genocide is what's implied. And supposedly this is going to be a Swiss team of historians that will analyze the facts and come down with a decision on it. There are a couple of other things we should mention in relation to this. First of all, it's also supposed to open the border between Turkey and Armenia. The assumption here is that the border is actually closed. It is closed, but only on Turkey's side. Right, the Armenian border is not closed. The Armenians have said they will open that border and leave it open whenever Turkey wants to open their side. The Republic of Armenia has not closed its border and says without any preconditions they will have that border opened. So it really is a matter of whether the Republic of Turkey wishes to open it. And finally, the reason why it was eventually shelved is that Turkey had consistently been asking for a resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict as a prerequisite for implementing the protocols. Armenia said we will not accept such a precondition. It's not written in the actual body of the text, but nonetheless, Turkey has continuously pressured them on that issue. And so just last week, the parliament decided that they were not going to address this issue at all, and the talks have been frozen, despite a tremendous amount of pressure by the U.S. administration and Russia. So we must keep those, all those factors in mind. Now, if we turn to Israel, we may notice a similar dichotomy in Israel. The Armenian genocide is, from my own experience, more recognized by people there than here. When I told people that I was a professor of Armenian studies, the first reaction of most people was, oh, they have a similar history to us. So there was a high degree of recognition of what had happened to the Armenians at the beginning of the 20th century. The history of Zionist attitudes towards the genocide and that of the State of Israel have been analyzed by the Israeli scholar Yair Oron in two groundbreaking works, The Banality of Indifference and The Banality of Denial. Both titles working off of Hannah Arendt's famous phrase, the banality of evil, which referred to the absolute normalness of most of the perpetrators of evil in history, and particularly the Holocaust. Many Israelis, such as Israel Charny, have been at the forefront of genocide studies in general and in educating others about the Armenian genocide. This, however, clearly is not reflected in the policy of the Israeli governments. Again, Turkey's position as a strategic partner, and a Muslim one at that, for Israel has been of the utmost importance. Israel, too, has been building ties with Azerbaijan, as recent trips by Shimon Peres have demonstrated. But there are other reasons. During the Inquisition, Jews were readily given refuge in the Ottoman Empire, and many are still grateful for this act of hospitality. There is still a Jewish population in Turkey, and some fear what would happen to them if Israel recognized the Armenian genocide. Finally, there are some who feel that the recognition of the Armenian genocide as genocide would in some way lessen the meaning of the Holocaust. Over the years, some Jewish lobbies within the United States have taken active steps to prevent the recognition of the Armenian genocide as genocide by the United States, supposedly in the defense of Israeli interests with the Republic of Turkey, and despite the outcry of many Jewish organizations, rabbis, and scholars. Recently, however, there have been greater motions in both the U.S. and Israel towards genocide recognition, the most recent being the passage of the House Foreign Affairs Committee's genocide resolution. Although this was not the first time such a measure in the House passed, it is part of a growing trend towards genocide recognition in the U.S. Similarly, the Israeli Knesset will consider a genocide recognition bill tomorrow in the Knesset on the 28th. It's unlikely that it'll pass, but nonetheless, they will be considering it tomorrow. While, indeed, I believe it is important for both the United States and Israel to officially recognize the Armenian genocide as genocide, I am troubled by the context in which this action is being taken. The underlying moral and legal foundations of genocide are being undermined by the highly politicized context in which the resolutions are being forwarded. Most worrisome is the use of genocide recognition as a political weapon. As the basis of denial or lack of recognition was founded upon the notion of an alliance with Turkey and not hurting our friends' feelings, similarly, recognition is seen as a way of expressing dissatisfaction with that relationship, whether because of Turkey's lack of support for the Iraq War, as was seen in 2005, or whether because, as in 2007, the Turkish criticism of Israel's military operations in Gaza termed Israel's actions as genocide. Genocide must be recognized for moral and legal reasons, and not become a political bargaining chip. Its use as such is diminishing the full weight of the term. This has created further problems in the resolution of Caucasian tensions. One of the clauses in the protocols to which Armenians objected, as I noted, is the creation of a historical commission to investigate the past of the events of Armeno-Turkish history. Given the politicization of the term genocide, many Armenians have justly questioned the unbiased nature of such a commission. If the very term genocide itself is susceptible to such relative status, there is no guarantee that any historical commission will not be swayed by political considerations or political pressure. As the 1985 letter to the New York Times has already demonstrated, scholars do not belong to some disassociated class of human being that is removed from the biases and preoccupations that motivate politicians, businessmen, and generals. We like to believe we are, but we're not. The use of the Armenian genocide is also dangerous at this particular moment because of the growing movement towards recognition among people in Turkey. As Turkish intellectual scholars and citizens come to face their own past and acknowledge the darker aspects of it, their efforts will suffer if recognition is used or perceived to be used as a tool against Turkey. In many ways, it resembles the use of the Armenian question by the great powers at the end of the 19th century. This approach only deepened resentment towards Armenians and obfuscated the reality of the condition of Armenians in the empire. The failure of that policy to prevent the genocide should stand as a warning to the political players today. For I agree that the United States and Israel should recognize the Armenian genocide, but precisely for that reason only, because it was a genocide. Not as any message to Turkey, not as some sort of diplomatic game in which we can get Turkey to do what we want, but simply and plainly as a message of recognition of historical truth. The desire to create regional stability in the very volatile Southern Caucasus and between Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan is in and of itself naturally a good thing. The prospects of a local conflict escalating into a more dangerous regional and international conflict are quite high and would be disastrous for all parties involved, and especially for the Armenians. However, true stability cannot be founded on mistrust and deception. At the heart of the political tension rests the Armenian genocide. Genocide recognition should not be based upon political calculations, retracted or forwarded as a reward or punishment. It must be recognized in acknowledgement of its legal and moral standing. I hope that in the near future, the U.S., Israel, and Turkey, among others, will come to that conclusion and truly encourage the development of regional security, peace, and prosperity. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're ready for some questions. Although your voice is pretty good. You don't necessarily need questions.
Is the dean good for sure?
The dean gets the first.
Thank you, by the way, because it's such a complex history.
Yeah.
I never got it, and I'm sure I got a bit of it, but at least I know where I need to go. The other day in the New York Times, there was a story about Obama and the commemoration. We didn't call it a genocide, and still it irritated Turkey. And now I understand why in terms of the complexity, but I wonder if you would address it in terms of Turkish response, even when we don't call it a genocide.
Right, yeah, and this is precisely, I think, the pit we've dug ourselves into. And making genocide recognition part and parcel of a political process in which I believe the Obama administration is trying to do is, I hope, this is what they're saying they're doing, is trying to create regional security and therefore will withhold use of this term because it creates greater instability. However, Turkey is not unaware of movements that they have a lot of soundings out. And so every time one of these issues come up, they rightly, I mean, from their perspective, get nervous. And so what it starts to look like is that the term genocide, which we've withheld for so long, claiming this alliance, and which we now no longer defend, let's say, we're not so brazen to say that it wasn't a genocide. Nobody has the guts to say that because they know it's not true. Because we're not willing to say one or the other, we're caught in this moral ambiguity that every time now we make, we want to say, well, a lot of people got killed. It seemed, that we got close to a tragedy. It's listed amongst other genocides. So, Turkey can obviously read the writing on the wall, and they can react with impunity. Because what are we going to say back to them? I don't like putting it in terms of we don't help or hurt we don't help our politics, because obviously we manage to annoy both sides by doing this. But I don't see how we can get out of that, because we put ourselves into a position where we've tried to not use it as a truth, but rather as a diplomatic bargaining chip. And once you've entered that moral ambiguity, then there's no way really to extract yourself from it, unless he had made a clean break at the very beginning of his administration and said, look, this has nothing to do with our strategic alliance with Turkey, which is very important to us. What happened in 1915 was a genocide. Turkey would have recalled its ambassadors. Maybe they would have, prevented us from using our military bases, which they don't let us use anyway. Our businesses may have been boycotted. France went through the same thing. 6 months later, things returned to normal. And I say this not that I don't believe the U.S. should be pressuring Turkey to accept it. I believe that's something that has to be done within Turkey, and we should encourage scholars there any way we can. But I wouldn't apply political pressure on Turkey to recognize it. But for our own selves, and this is where it's an important issue for me as an American, that we don't recognize it, that we deny our own history. and launching this major humanitarian relief effort because we're afraid that it may annoy somebody, to me is a shameful act on our own part in terms of how we treat our own citizens and the millions of people who donated money and time and effort, went over there and tried to help Armenians out, who gave them jobs when they came here, who gave them help when they came here. And we had millions and millions of Americans who worked really hard to try and save these people, and now they're also forgotten because we refuse to take this moral stance. And I find that is what I find objectionable. Thanks, John.
I would like to interject myself. I rarely do it, but I don't know why the Armenian community in the United States doesn't feel so betrayed. Presidential candidate after presidential candidate has written, if I'm elected, if you give me your support, I will recognize the Armenian genocide. And every one of them, be it Republican or Democrat.
Yeah, and they do feel betrayed. They do feel betrayed, and they feel disenfranchised in some respects, because it doesn't matter which candidate they pick. The result's going to be the same in some respects, and there's no way of sugarcoating. I think that the only one that came close to recognizing it was Ronald Reagan back in the 80s, who put it amongst other genocides. But since then, it's been one sort of negation after another by people who, yes, 1 year before were going to Armenian barbecues, eating pilaf and talking about the Armenian genocide, and then 1 year later they're saying, well, the very complex situation in Anatolia makes it difficult for history to judge. And look at how can you look at yourself in the mirror? I mean, doing that. I mean, obviously they can. They're politicians, but. Still, it is a rather disturbing, I would say, pattern. And that, if Turkey and the United States had taken care of this in 1965, let's say, it would be over by now. The reparations would have been paid. The issue would not be there. There would be stability, at least on this issue, within the region. And this would not be as big as an issue as it is. It just becomes bigger because of the denial. And I mean, Taner Akçam, I don't know if people studied Taner Akçam in the class. He's one of the few Turkish intellectuals. He's now at Clark University in Boston, in Massachusetts, professor of genocide there. He's come out forcefully, and he describes very acutely the amount of brainwashing that Turkish students have undergone all through their life on this issue as well as other issues, how they were given a historical narrative to their own past that they had to basically digest and memorize and incorporate. And he's saying that history is now, that narrative is now starting to crumble. Very slowly, people may have known there was a conference on the Armenian genocide. It's still going on right now in Turkey, or it was from the 26th, I think, to the 28th, I think were the dates. There were protests for the first time in public in Turkey on April 24th. There had been demonstrations in the past, but they were normally kept inside. And this time, for the first time, people actually went outside. There has been more and more outspoken voices, both amongst Turkish intellectuals and the populace, on this issue. And I'd like to see that encouraged, and I hope that will continue to move forward. And as Taner accurately says, it's the only way for Turkey to move forward. I don't know how much help that'll bring the Armenians at the end of the day, but it will certainly help Turkey in its coming to grips with this terrible part of its history. And then possibly at that point we can have further discussion about moving forward. But until, it's a common ploy in negotiations and conflict resolution to try and leave these more hotly debated issues until the end. Take small steps to build trust between the opposing parties, and then at the end, you can come together and agree upon, once you have that relationship of trust, on more difficult aspects of your relationship. I don't know if that works in the Middle East in general, and particularly not in this particular issue. If you don't tackle the issue of the Armenian genocide first and foremost, if you don't have Turkey recognize that fact, there will never be stability in that area, as far as I can tell, because the historical record will never be cleared up.
Okay. Question? Yes.
I've been struck throughout your lecture by the significant difference between the way Germany in subsequent generations has handled its history of genocide and the way Turkish people have handled it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a significant difference. I mean, some elements are still the same, in the sense that, many people who were part of the Nazi regime continue to function in post-World War II Germany as head of major corporations. The money that was taken was used to build up a German infrastructure. It's not as though, again, I wouldn't say people would like to say, well, the modern Republic of Germany has nothing to do with the Nazi regime of the Holocaust. Again, as though an entire permutation of peoples had happened, once they accepted the Nuremberg trials and surrendered and paid off, Jewish victims. No, the culture of the Nazi regime continued to exist, and Germany was forced, in many respects, by terms of surrender, to come to terms with the Holocaust. I think part of the reason why it was such a big deal was that it happened in Europe and not over there. Turkey, on the other hand, did not have a smooth transition of power. And German transition of power, at least West German transition of power between World War II and the modern republic, was fairly smooth. Between the genocide of 1915-1916 and the institution of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, a lot happened. Many people at that point, including in one article, Ataturk himself, talked about the annihilation of the Armenians. There was no attempt at that point to cover it up on such a basis. In fact, the first trials held on the issue of genocide were by the Ottoman government against the members of the CUP, where they were tried for death. And we have those archives, and they provide important evidence for the fact that it was a genocide. But again, the term genocide hadn't been coined yet. So they didn't have, but they just talked about the extermination of an entire people. So there were attempts afterwards to address the problem in Turkey. But as the Republic moved in 1923 to the Kemalist, Ataturk's nationalist state, this was seen as a position that would weaken the eventual Republic of Turkey, and I think a sort of defensive position erected itself in the sense that, Turkey would forever be associated with, they're the murderous Turk, the barbarous Turk. They're not a fully civilized nation. They're peoples who really aren't European. All of those stereotypes that had really been ensconced by the genocide as well, would never shake them. So I think that in some respects they reacted with this denialist position in order to protect the standing, the prestige, and the security of Turkey. And therefore, and they were not forced otherwise. I said, as events move through the 30s, we see American policy towards Turkey change. And Turkey once again becomes a key player in restraining Russia. And this is what shifts everything. And I think also 20 years after the genocide, by the time you get to 1935, other things are happening and people are tired. That issue in America, how much more were Americans going to do? And in some ways, it laid the blueprint for what could then happen, both in terms of genocide in the Holocaust, but also in how do you actually fix it, but handle the reparations? How do you try the criminals? How do you go about following the persecutors? I mean, it never happened before. When you talk about the Armenians, nobody knew what to do. I'm pretty sure that, I don't think the Turks thought it was a crime what they did. There doesn't seem to be any sort of indication that what they did would have been an international crime against humanity. That nobody was thinking in those terms then, as far as I can tell. They obviously tried to sweep it under the rug, but that seemed more because they knew that Europe was looking out and would not be too happy with it. But as a sort of moral question, I don't think that bothered them as much. And so there was, I think, more pressure, in the German case. But still, there's never been an unsuccessful genocide. All right? One thing you can learn from genocide is that it works. If you want to eliminate your peoples, you can do it and you will get away from it. Germany has not paid the same price that the Jews paid at all. They paid a significant amount of money, but Germany's still there. They still have a high standard of living. They may have this, blot on their, or tarnish their image, but a couple of generations later, they're already saying it's not us, we have nothing to do with it, we've moved on. We can be critical of Jews again because we're not Nazis, because we're so anti-Nazi that it doesn't fall on us. So, I mean, if anybody is studying, just as Hitler studied the Armenian genocide, what are you going to notice? You'll get away with it. There's no country that's really paid the price for it. Because once it's happened, it's too late. I mean, that's been the other, major development, I think, in genocide studies, and particularly on the Armenian genocide as well, is how do you stop it? I mean, the only way you can prevent it, you have to stop it before it happens. And so when people start arguing, is it genocide, is it not genocide? Well, by the time you decide, and normally people say you have to wait for everybody to be killed for it to be a genocide. Well, what are you going to do about, oh, great, it's genocide, thank you very much, everyone's dead, and what are you going to do now? So this is a major problem in the way the world reacts to this. And precisely it's because it's a political issue. And people forget that this is supposed to be a legal and moral term, not a political debate as to whether, oh, it's a punishment to call it a genocide. If it's just a massacre, it's okay. You're not really on the B list until you make it to genocide. And then you can be a founding member of a European nation after you commit it. But, I mean, that seems to be one of the... Sorry. Yeah, it seems to be one of the prerequisites to being like a world leader is that you had to commit a genocide at some point in your past. But it's shameful. It's really a problem. But sorry.
Thanks for an outstanding lecture. My question was about the protocol that initiated. First of all, who's the architect of that? And it seems to be one-sided. Number two, is there any anticipation to just kind of play along and have the whole issue drag on and then back off at the end, or was it a sincere commitment from both sides?
Yeah, both very good questions to which I don't have what I would consider official answers. I'm not more in the know than anyone else regarding the actual composition of the protocols themselves. I can say without a question that there was huge U.S. pressure to come to an agreement such as the protocols. Who the actual architects in terms of the wording, and the whole thing was done in secrecy to begin with. Nobody from outside of the small coterie of government officials, I think, were really aware of what was going on in terms of the actual composition of the protocols. The only thing that was clear is that there was pressure from the United States and Russia to get this deal done somehow and at any price. We know that obviously the Armenian administration was not goo gaga over them. In fact, Hillary Clinton personally drove the foreign minister in Albania to the signing ceremony just to make sure there were no hiccups. So, obviously they were not rushing into this going like, yes, we've achieved peace in our time. Nobody, they were hoping at best that, I think they probably got one of the best sort of results, which is nothing happened. Maybe if it worked, things may have been different, but it's also, I think Yerevan was sincere in that they were going to go through with it. They didn't have much of an option. I mean, if people remember the budget last year with regards to Armenia, where they sliced Armenian aid by 38% and they upped Azerbaijani aid by 20%, although that was not approved by the Congress, nonetheless, that was the administration's budget in terms of aid. It was a clear warning shot saying if you don't handle Nagorno-Karabakh the way we want you to, you're going to lose it anyway because the Azeris are going to have more money and more military. They keep on talking about it achieving military parity between the two sides, as though Armenia had this gargantuan military force in its arsenal with a running budget of, I think, last I knew it was like 800. Microsoft has a bigger budget than the Republic of Armenia. But so I think Armenia was actually faithful in the road it took along with the protocols, that it would go through with it if that's the way Turkey was going, and with pressure from the United States. But Turkey never gave up on the precondition of Nagorno-Karabakh, even though it's not in the actual document itself. And I think President Sarkisian and the government knew that if Armenia even seemed to be approving that, there would have been a revolution on their hands. And not to mention the fact that, as people have said, the money comes from here too. And there was no way diasporan Armenians were going to go along with it. So I think at the end of the day, those two factors, had Turkey come out and said, you know, we're really giving up on the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, we're not going to push that for this deal, I don't know how it would have went, whether they could have found some other reason not to sign them. But at least ostensibly, Turkey's insistence on a Nagorno-Karabakh resolution before these things could be implemented definitely knocked it off the rails as far as Armenia is concerned. Though the administration is still happy, which is probably the reason why it didn't use the word genocide this year again for the second year in a row, that the talks haven't been canceled, they've just been frozen. So we definitely don't want to set them off the rail again by using the word genocide and therefore, you know, create further instability in the region, blah, 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 blah. But I hope that answered your question as much as I know. As I said, I don't have any key inside information on either government, unfortunately, or fortunately for me. But
Will you all join me in thanking Professor?
thank you.